Hey everyone, and welcome to the start of a new series of lectures, Post-Communist Transitions in Eastern Europe and Central Asia. My name is Dr. Michael Rossi, and I serve as Assistant Professor in the Department of Political Science at Long Island University, Brooklyn, where I'm also the Director of the newly created program in International Relations. And prior to me moving to LIU Brooklyn, as many of you know, I taught for many years in the Poli-Sci department at Rutgers University, and part of those duties involved teaching one course every summer for their master's degree program in United Nations and Global Policy Studies. And it's been about 2 to 3 years since I taught the post-communist transitions class to the UN grad students, and I'm happy to offer this again in the summer of 2021, and equally happy to put these lectures for the first time on my YouTube channel. So for those of you who are formally enrolled in this 6-week intensive graduate course, please take a look at the syllabus to see what your readings are and what your writing requirements are. Those of you that are listening passively, just for the interest in it, I welcome all of you aboard, and I hope that the material that I have to offer in these lectures provides something that is not only informative, but also entertaining, right? That's usually my motto in all of these courses. So let's get started right away here, because there's a lot of material to cover, and this short lecture just introduces you to the overarching themes of what we're going to be looking at over the next 5 to 6 weeks. And, you know, like the beginning to each course, it's worth looking at what the course actually covers. As the name implies, we will be looking at advanced theoretical, historical, and comparative studies of social and political transitions from single-party communist rule in Eastern Europe and Central Asia, which fits rather nicely within the larger study of democratic transition theory, which straddles really the subfields of both comparative politics and international relations in political science, right? It's one of those applied subjects within the poli-sci discipline, one that was a real hot subject in the early to mid-2000s, and one that I've really taken to heart ever since I was a grad student. Now, obviously, there are multiple ways in which we can examine the theoretical transitions from authoritarianism to democracy. To keep it simple and to keep the theme streamlined, I want to focus this class on the relation of the nature of both the authoritarian regime and the conditions of regime collapse. So in other words, rather than assuming that all authoritarian states are the same, right, which they're not, I want to look at the capabilities and the degrees of limited freedoms and civil liberties that each authoritarian regime had prior to its collapse, to note what possibilities, what paths of transitions might be available for these countries as they move towards greater degrees of democratic pluralism. We're also going to be looking alongside of this the regional importance of statecraft and governance in proximity to exogenous influences. Now, this also is a rather jargonistic way of saying, how do states like Poland and Slovakia and Albania and Ukraine and Kyrgyzstan and Serbia and Belarus and others transition amid the omnipresent existence of at least one major international influence? And whether that happens to be the European Union for Central Europe and the Balkans, Russia for most of the former Soviet Union, and even China recently, not just with Central Asia, but in many cases for both Central Europe and Southeastern Europe in the wake of the 2008 economic recession. it bears attention to note that policy leaders don't necessarily democratize in a vacuum, and they can't really choose whatever it is that they want without meeting some kind of approval, right? Especially, economic approval of many of these other powerful actors. To that I could also include the United States, but the U.S., interestingly enough, doesn't play that much of an important factor in this part of the world. The U.S. has kind of taken a back seat more so to the European Union's efforts, specifically in Central and Southeastern Europe. And so that leads us to provide a follow-up question to this. Why have some countries democratized better and faster than others? It's one thing to look at these countries transitioning in the early 1990s, but it's another to sort of assess 30 years later where they've gone. And yes, some countries have become liberal consolidated democracies, key players in European Union administration. Other countries are still democratizing. They have certainly reached a point of structural consolidation, but they haven't entered the European Union just yet. And these are a few small countries within the Balkans, Serbia being the primary example. And then when we look at countries of the former Soviet Union, we note that there is a significant drop-off in democratic capability, more so because of their closer proximity to both Moscow and Beijing. And that doesn't necessarily imply that Russia and China are pushing for non-democracies so much as they're not really interested in liberal democratic practice as a prerequisite for economic cooperation and assistance. So, this normative question, why have some countries transitioned better and faster than others, is something that's been asked since the mid-1990s. And there's a whole bunch of hypotheses that go along into it, including, historical legacies, proximity to the European Union, different cultural behaviors and norms. We're going to be looking at all of that within the next 6 weeks or so. And, alongside that, I want to, debunk some of the prevailing assumptions that still permeate not just academic, but even more importantly, policy circles. A third element that we're going to be examining is, keeping in the theme of why countries are sometimes better democratically than others, we're going to be looking at really the quality of democracy. It's one thing to examine the democratic capabilities of any country by simply looking at electoral patterns and procedures, right? And there's a general understanding that if a country has periodic elections and the turnover is honored, it's a democracy. That's not entirely incorrect, but that is, in my opinion, more of a minimal requirement for democracy. When I note the quality of a democracy, and I put quality in quotes here, I'm really looking at why some countries just seem to work better, why the quality of life is better. And, this might be a bit of a controversial statement to make, but some countries that might be regarded as less structurally democratic than others still provides, I think, a better quality of life than those model democracies that Newsweek and The Economist and CNN constantly point to and say, these are the role models that the developing world needs to follow. And, I think that one of the things, and this is a new theme that I'm bringing into the 2021 version of this class, is I think it's important at this point to really evaluate the merits and shortcomings of what we euphemistically call a liberal democracy, which both within the academic and the policymaking circles is still assumed to be sort of like, the highest evolutionary level of what a democracy can be. And to be very quick and general about it, right? A liberal democracy is one that upholds the individual rights of the citizen, which, by just hearing that definition, there's nothing really wrong about that. But liberal democracies oftentimes are differentiated from, I don't want to say popular democracies or less developed democracies, but those democracies that really promote the collective rights of the group. Up until recently, liberal democracies were seen as a higher evolutionary state, but the problem that we find is that really since 2008, this is when things really began to take a turn, I wouldn't say for the worse, but definitely the understanding of liberal democracies has come under greater scrutiny. We've noted since then the rise of a number of illiberal democratic movements and regimes in Central and Southeastern Europe, particularly a type of national populism that permeates Hungary, Serbia, Poland, to a lesser extent a type of elite oligarchy that dominates the political clientelism of the Czech Republic and such. And while it might be tempting to say that these are just simple bumps in the road before the country gets back on track to Euroliberalism, I mean, how long can a hiccup last? Some of these countries have been like that for years, if not more than a decade. And does this have something to do with maybe the shortcomings of what liberal democracies are? So, I guess in this case, this class is not just going to look at the period of transition, but where these countries have gone, what they have transitioned into over the past 30 years or so. And, it is rather difficult to avoid the inconvenient reality that in 2021, we've noted a notable decline in democratic governance, even among a number of countries that we previously regarded as success stories. These are primarily countries of Central Europe that democratized first, got into the European Union first, and, just kind of end the story. You get into the EU, it's a done deal. What we find afterwards is, getting into the EU is one thing. Once you're in the EU, there's not really a lot of scrutiny. There's not a lot of chances to be audited by, outside observers. So, you do what you can to kind of get into the Ivy League university. And then when you get in, you can kind of coast as a C student. But, hey, you're still part of that elite club. What explains some of these patterns? And finally, we're going to be looking, and this is really towards the end of these talks, we're going to be looking at a few prognoses for maybe the next 5 to 10 years of where these countries are going, where the regions might be going. And, I might offer some suggestions for how to address the problems of neoliberal approaches to democracy, which still seems to be the preferred model, particularly among those that advance the idea that the European Union is the greatest thing that ever happened to many of these countries. And, when we extend that argument to those 5 or so countries that have not yet got into the EU, right, the understanding is neoliberalism will provide these countries and their citizenry the necessary materials for liberal democratic consolidation, which will get them into this, gated community of democratic nations. I'm a bit less optimistic than I was a few years ago, and the trend, seems to really be showing us that a lot of these illiberal democratic movements are kind of here to stay, at the absolute least for the immediate future. So this, leads us to examine some of the larger questions that this class will be investigating, chief of which, and I've already sort of alluded to this, is, why is it after 30 years of transition, modernization, development, have most former communist countries continued to struggle towards achieving democratic consolidation and good governance? Now, on one level, it's tempting to just kind of focus on this region alone with this handicap and sort of default to a hypothesis that suggests, well, because these countries were communist or, engaged in single-party authoritarian rule from anywhere between 45 to 75 years, it's difficult for democracies to grow and consolidate this early. And that's not necessarily all that incorrect, but, if we were to, expand outward and look at the state of democracy in the rest of Europe, let alone, let's say, North America, it's also obvious to note that, the patterns of democratic development and good governance have come under significant challenge across the board. not just in Western Europe like France or Italy or even Germany after, Angela Merkel leaves, it's sort of unknown who's going to take over. But even in the United States, which, I don't want to focus too much on the U.S. in this class, but it's sort of obvious to note Donald Trump is not really an anomaly to the state of democracy in this country, but I think more of a consequence of the way things are going. So, by that measure, it's not enough to just simply say, all right, democracies have kind of taken a beating over the past couple of years. They're not in danger of collapsing, but, they're not as, inclusive. They're not as cosmopolitan. They're not as all-encompassing as we might have thought them to be. So are there, any inherent historical handicaps or legacies that have impeded the process? This is something that academics love to research. And this, runs the gamut, as I said, from the legacy of communism, the interwar legacy that predated communism, where your country emerged from what multinational empire, the Austrian Empire, the Ottoman, the Russian Empire. All of these make really interesting conversations, but a lot of times some of these hypotheses can go off in wild tangential directions. And the second thing that we're going to be asking, and it's also something that I've already alluded to, are what are the roles of external actors in shaping and directing the transition paths available and influencing and even exploiting the different tasks countries face in those transitions. So one thing off the bat that I want to acknowledge is that at least half of the countries that we're examining have either transitioned already within the structural confines and roadmap given to them by the European Union, or are still doing so prior to membership. And this is a rather unique opportunity for a certain select group of countries that in any other part of the world are kind of left adrift to transition largely at the behest of the World Bank, the IMF, maybe even the United States. For most of the countries of continental Europe, and that's including Central and Southeastern Europe, there is a notable roadmap that the European Union has given them, saying at the end of the road, your reward for doing the right, making the right choices is membership in this exclusive organization. So it's important to note that the European Union has wielded a significant amount of leverage towards aspiring members. But while many earlier assessments have said that the European Union was really a blessing, sort of a unique ace in the hole for many of these countries, 30 years later, the EU is really not that panacea that we thought it would be. The European Union, if anything, reminds us that it is an economic regulatory body. It is not an organization that really upholds, let alone enforces, a type of liberal democracy. And, we saw this beginning with the 2008 economic crisis, in which countries that were struggling economically were pressured by the European Union to engage more in technocratic solutions for achieving economic balance and stability. And if this came at the cost of democratic accountability and democratic sovereignty, well, then so be it. Exhibit A was Greece, which was almost thrown under the bus just for the sake of, preventing, a run on banks across the rest of the organization. So the European Union has done, I would say, a fair job in providing at least a structural format for democracy, but they're not really all that big on understanding the more behavioral or collective value-oriented elements of democracy, what I like to call democracy as practice, right? A culture of democracy, which is something that we see really, at a weak point in Poland, Hungary, Croatia, the Czech Republic, among others that have been long-standing members of the European Union. Alongside the EU, what about Russia, right, or the United States, or more recently China? The former communist bloc countries are not transitioning, as I said, on their own, but they are doing so under the guidance, the diplomacy. Some of it might be passive, some of it might be more coercive, of these larger countries. And so, it's not enough to just simply say that, one's culture is more prone towards democracy or not. I mean, every country has the capability of being unbelievably democratic and at the same time unbelievably xenophobic. And this is something that we will also be looking at. I might be getting ahead of myself here, but it's something that we will be noting, at least in the first section on Central Europe, where, erstwhile success stories have done so structurally, but there's a huge degree of xenophobia, exclusionary nationalism, and nativism that permeates the political cultures of Poland and Hungary and the Czech Republic and Croatia and even Slovenia, for that matter. And does this handicap these countries' democratic capabilities? Does this somehow enable more illiberal, nationalistic-minded governments that will still believe in the practice of democracy to seize power and, change trajectory of these countries' orientations, right? A lot of things are going to be on the table. And so, it bears mention once again our areas of study. This is a 6-week intensive course, which, like all summer courses at Rutgers, try to take a 14, 15-week semester and just condense it into 6 weeks. So there's going to be a lot of readings and a lot of lectures. So by structuring it around a 6-week segment, the middle 4 weeks are going to be examining each of these regions in detail. Central Europe, in which we will be looking exclusively at Poland, Hungary, and Slovakia. Southeastern Europe, more commonly known as the Balkans, where we will examine Serbia, Croatia, and Romania. Then, the following week, Russia and the so-called near abroad, which, just because of the information and the events that are happening, we'll be looking at Russia and Ukraine. I mentioned in the video launch lecture that I might offer some, side material at Belarus, still one of the longest standing authoritarian states. And then finally, Central Asia, which is a group of countries that most people know the least about, right? And, we will be surveying at least the following countries: Turkmenistan, Kazakhstan, and Kyrgyzstan. Recently, Kyrgyzstan proved to be a rather interesting case. Of all the countries in Central Asia, or at least of the former Soviet Union, it was the one that exhibited the most potential for some democratic capabilities. The last year or so, things have taken a turn for the worst, and a previously partly free country has unfortunately fallen back into not free. Now, alongside that, we're going to introduce you all to what I like to call a cast of characters, some of whom you probably already know. Viktor Orban is widely regarded as kind of the pioneer of this model of illiberal democratic populism, not just in Central Europe, but also increasingly now his brand is being taken up in the Balkans. The current Polish Prime Minister, Jarosław Kaczynski, very much a conservative, a social conservative for that matter. And while he's not as forceful as Orban is in sort of creating these executive decisions on Polish political culture and identity, has been working within his larger party, the Law and Justice Party, to add a certain degree of parochialism to Polish identity, which alongside Hungary is becoming quite poignantly very much anti-LGBT, anti-liberal, anti-cosmopolitan, and very much in favor of restoring national borders and emphasizing the importance of national heritage and culture. A lesser-known individual, and one who was recently served as Prime Minister of Slovakia, Igor Matovic, he serves as a real interesting example of what I call an entrepreneurial politician, right? Someone who as opposed to, let's say, the Orbans and Kaczynskis that advocate populism, sort of advocate this idea of non-ideological politics, sort of a catch-all politician who starts off really as a business person, more of a business entrepreneur who enters politics as a way of presenting himself as an alternative to the usual, run-of-the-mill, corrupt, oligarchic, self-serving, political leader. Then when we move into the Balkans, we're going to examine the leadership, the surprisingly state capture leadership of Aleksandar Vučić, who works quite well with Orban, and another role model of his, I'm sure you all know this guy, Vladimir Putin, the longtime strongman and political power broker of Russia. When we look at Ukraine, we will be examining the current leadership of Volodymyr Zelensky, who is trying to navigate through some extremely volatile waters within Ukrainian political culture between one group that wants nothing to do with Russia ever again and another group that says Ukraine cannot function without a cooperative arrangement with Russia. And as long as Putin is the one that Zelensky is negotiating with, he's largely going up against, a world-class chess master. Sapar Murat Niyazov, largely known as Turkmenbashi, is a previous leader of Turkmenistan, and I include him because he just comes to represent sort of this ideological political strongman that takes over an entire country of Central Asia, and it was largely ignored by Western media. More than happy by Russia to, consider to wage some type of paternalistic, top-down authoritarian rule in the name of stability. Niyazov's death a few years ago, he was succeeded by another strongman in Turkmenistan, and so they really come to represent almost the exact opposite of political pluralism and flexibility that we would see in Central and Southeastern Europe. And finally, I always like to make mention, especially if we talk about someone like, Turkmenbashi, we also have to note Rosa Otunbayeva, who is one of the few real, true, genuine leaders of liberal democracy, of civic activism within Central Asia. She was interim president of Kyrgyzstan for about a year and a half or so, and it was really under her temporary leadership that Kyrgyzstan moved the closest towards some type of nascent democratic state building. So, alongside these, people that I'm hoping that by the end of class you'll be familiar with and you'll grow to understand and maybe even appreciate in some way, our class is also going to be met with a couple of guest speakers whom I always love bringing into the discussion for each section. So our section on Central Europe will be accompanied by Dr. Jan Kubik. Many of you at Rutgers know who he is. Our section on the Balkans will be met with my friend and colleague, Dr. Mladen Mrdal. The week on Russia and the near abroad, Nikolai Petro has always been a fantastic and engaging speaker. And for Central Asia, we are welcoming for the first time my colleague, Dr. Lawrence Markowitz of Rowan University. So we've got a lot of things to cover within the coming 6 weeks, a lot of lecture material. For those of you that are enrolled, a lot of readings. For those of you that are listening just on YouTube, and if you might be interested in the readings that are accompanying each lecture, please take a look at the descriptions below. I will put the accompanying readings there. If you are able to find them online, great. If any of you are interested in reading them yourself, please feel free to email me, and I'll be more than happy to send you the PDFs. All right, so with the introduction out of the way, let's finish up this first video by looking at one of the first big questions for this class. Why study post-communism, right? Why do we still call it post-communism? Note that I put the term in quotes here. Aren't post-communist studies really part of a larger collection of democratic transition theory? In fact, within the academic literature, the countries transitioning from 89 to 91 are part of a larger family of what we call third wave democratic transitions, right? The third wave of countries that began really in the early 1970s, 73, 74 with Portugal and Greece, finally culminating in 1975 with Spain. And then throughout the 1980s, a few nascent democratic transition movements in Latin America, only to really climax in the late 80s and early 90s with the collapse of communist governments. So, why single them out if they are already part of a larger collection of authoritarian states that transition amid some kind of negotiated agreement between moderates in the old regime and those within the democratic challenging contingent. To that, shouldn't we also consider communism a thing of the past? I mean, we are already in the year 2020. Why do we still call many of these countries post-communist? Why do we still refer to Eastern Europe as post-communist Europe, right? Why are we referencing something that's been gone for more than a quarter of a century? And if you really want to, make the argument, the ideology of communism as any meaningful sense of political culture, I think, ceased any kind of saliency in the late 60s, right? I mean, obviously these countries went under the name and the symbolism of communism up to 89 to 91. But any real belief in communist philosophies, Marxism, Leninism, whatever, really just kind of died out with the rise of these non-charismatic, uncreative, bureaucratic authoritarian regimes that just kind of characterize really the last 15 to 20 years, particularly in Central and Southeastern Europe. If we are still to call them post-communist, what effects does communism really have on successive governments today? How much of a communist legacy really dominates the political culture of Hungary or the former Yugoslavia or Bulgaria or Poland or Lithuania or whatever, right? I mean, you can kind of look at it also in another way. Of the countries that are still technically communist today, there's 5 of them, right? There's China, there's Vietnam, Laos, North Korea, and Cuba. How many of them are really ideologically driven towards communism, towards Marxism? Maybe the most, maybe possible, would be Cuba. It's very hard to say that China is communist today when they're the second largest market economy. And it's sort of also interesting that those that are trying to push Marxist orthodoxy in China are falling under the scrutiny of the state. So how communist really is China? And to that, we can also add Vietnam as well. North Korea is certainly, officially, symbolically communist, but a better way of looking at that authoritarian apparatus is really a type of Orwellian sultanistic regime. It's really more so whatever the Kim family wants that day, right? They don't, open up Marx or Lenin, and recite chapter and verse what needs to be done. Right? They don't really care about that, right? Laos, very few people know anything about Laos. It's more of a military dictatorship than anything else. So, why use the term communism? Is it just because old habits die hard? Because we like to stigmatize the region? And, when you think about this, we don't really call any other country that has transitioned at some point post whatever, right? Like Germany is not a post-fascist country. Unless you really engage in world systems theory, you're not going to look at Latin America and call it the post-colonial world. The same thing goes for much of sub-Saharan Africa. We don't look at Italy or Spain and call it post-fascist either. So why do we use the term? Why do we still use the term? And to that, if we're going to call it post-communist, it kind of forces us to work within a certain set of beliefs and axioms, within the subject of post-communist transition. I mean, what new material is there to research that hasn't been discovered, already? I mean, look, I do work in academia, and I can tell you that, of the dozens and dozens of academic peer-reviewed journals out there, that publish, maybe 4 or 5 times a year. And you kind of look at a lot of these articles that are there, and you're just like, all right, what new is, a lot of this stuff is just publishing for the sake of, getting tenure or getting promoted. I mean, for those students that are enrolled, take a look at the syllabus, and you'll note that some of the articles are pushing almost, 10 years or so. And it's not because I don't want to give you anything new. It's just that there really hasn't been anything new that offers big picture assessments of the subject. There was a renewed interest around the 25th anniversary of '89. But the 30th anniversary kind of came and went in 2019. Just a few assessments, here or there. But we still call it that. We still kind of look at Eastern Europe a little bit differently than that of Western. And sure, cities like Prague and Warsaw and even Belgrade, for that matter, right, have a cosmopolitan character to them. But it's not the same as Paris or Vienna, right, or Brussels or Milan. You're not going to get that same degree of equal parity, right? Eastern Europe is still going to be seen as the groups of countries and people that are emerging into an already established community of democratic nations from 45 years of, cinder block, gray, brutalist architectural communist rule. Right? And so that stigma is still going to be there, even if it's unfounded. And of course, you look at social media these days and sort of this renewed interest in communist nostalgia, all of those images of those brutalist apartment buildings or squatting Slavs in Adidas tracksuits are certainly going to be playing on these stereotypes that make the region different from the rest. But, doesn't this just do nothing more than perpetuate stereotypes, right? Especially the type of stereotypes that Sam Huntington, sort of formulated in his book, The Clash of Civilizations. So wouldn't it just be better at some point to just refer to the areas now as either consolidated but still with work to do, or a handful of countries that are still on their way towards, full democratic liberalization? And when we look at Central Asia, for that matter, how much of the communist element can we really say characterizes politics today when many of the Stan countries became more authoritarian than they were under the former Soviet Union? So, in cases like Turkmenistan and Uzbekistan and Tajikistan, the golden years, the high point was the Soviet Union. So communism wasn't anything to look down upon. And in many cases, life was as good as it was going to get. Today, yes, these countries are awash with money, but for a very small cadre of political elites, while the rest of the population either has to kowtow and buy into this corrupt oligarchic system or look for, better paying work if one exists, within Russia or, increasingly China. So to answer my question, right, why do we still use the term post-communism? There are actually a lot of reasons, a little bit more than some of you, might think here. But as I mentioned in the beginning of this lecture, the crux of this course will be examining the nature of authoritarian transition along political, economic, and sociocultural axioms. So if our goal is to go for maximum strength democracy, right? If our purpose is to really ask, why have some countries democratized better and faster than others? I'm not stopping at the minimal requirement of periodic elections, right? If you have that, this is a pretty fast and simple class here, case closed. But if the goal here is to look at not just democracy, but good governance, especially these qualities that are emerging from a pre-authoritarian, a pre-democratic, structure of omnipresent state control, then what we're looking for needs to be placed within the context of what these countries are transitioning from. Right? They're not transitioning to democracy in a vacuum. And some countries transitioned from an authoritarian structure that had a bit more political rights and civil liberties than others. And, so I don't want to give away the plot just yet, but if Poland and Hungary were considered success stories as recent as the early to mid-2000s, well, then we should kind of look at the communist authoritarian apparatus that characterized these states in the mid-'80s. And they were much more open and flexible and, dare I even say, liberal than more closed-off regimes like Bulgaria, police states that effectively characterized Romania and East Germany. And, we know very little about communism in Albania, but it was pretty much up there with, this type of hermetically sealed North Korean-style dictatorship. So, the nature of authoritarianism especially one that works for omnipotent state control. That's part of the aspect of communist power apparatus. Is going to give us really the foundations of where these countries can transition into. And we also have to take a look at the association that these countries have with international communities and organizations. So I've already mentioned, right, the European Union offered some kind of roadmap for at least half of the countries under study. But alongside that, NATO usually was an organization that these countries got membership in before the EU. So it was kind of this understanding that if you can kind of get into NATO, you're on your way towards getting into the European Union, right? It's kind of like a halfway mark, like a little reward, like congratulations, you're in NATO, yay. And along the way, and this isn't as prestigious, but it certainly is padding on your resume, you become a member of the OSCE, the Organization of Security and Cooperation in Europe. And I think the importance of international communities kind of stepping up to the plate in the early 90s was the assumption, and it was an erroneous assumption, but it was an assumption nonetheless, that many of these countries emerging from decades of quote-unquote Leninism had absolutely no capability whatsoever in finding the right path towards democracy on their own. So it was sort of the burden of the then known European community to reach out and extend a hand of help to Poland, to Hungary, to Czechoslovakia, right, to the former Yugoslavia, and say, look, we know that you'll eventually get it, but it might take decades. So in order for us to speed this process up, and in order to maintain stability within Europe, let the European Union kind of help you along the way. Now, this doesn't necessarily have anything to do with communism per se, as it does the perceptions of communism, the perceptions of single-party Leninist rule, which, as I mentioned, was seen as absolutely antithetical towards any kind of democratic social capital. And so that leads us to look at, in a broader sense, the important nature of political culture in each of these countries that shapes attitudes towards models of parliamentary democracy. It's one thing, as I've already mentioned, to create the structures of democracy, right? You have a parliament, you've got at least two, if not more, political parties, you have a constitution, you have periodic elections. For some people, end of story. All you need to do is just do the right performances every so often, get into the European Union, kick back, light up, end of story. I feel that that's only half of what is needed. Obviously, there is a political culture that continues to exist amid a period of transition. And in a lot of cases, it's one thing to get rid of the communist apparatus, but it's another thing to get rid of the mindset, the bureaucratic mindset, the understanding among the ordinary population that the individual doesn't really have many rights, and without money or connections, you really just can't, produce anything good. And that has led to the persistence of political oligarchism, primarily in Central Europe, but, also very much on display in many of the former countries of Yugoslavia. So this leads us to examine the controversies surrounding the legacies of communism and also what 1989 was really all about. And that's going to be the subject of the next lecture, is sort of assessing what happened in 1989, 30 years later. And as a sneak preview to that, right, the question that we're now beginning to ask, this is something that I'm at least asking in the last few years, is, are we reading Eastern Europe right? Even more to the point, have we been reading it right? Have we correctly interpreted, or have we misread the events of 1989? There's a general assumption, at least within the West, and by West I'm saying Western Europe, particularly the United States, that the social revolutions that challenged single-party dictatorships in 1989 were on full display a rejection of communism, right? That's what the people wanted. The people finally just rose up and they said, down with Karl Marx, down with Vladimir Lenin, down with Joseph Stalin, down with the hammer and sickle. We want free market capitalism. We want Disney World. We want Big Macs. We want Ronald Reagan. We want Margaret Thatcher. We don't want Mikhail Gorbachev. I mean, that at least was the narrative that was, or seemingly was, on display through, CBS, NBC, ABC, CNN, what have you, is that these social revolutions, the people had just finally woken up and were rejecting socialism, rejecting Marxism, right? That was the understanding, is that the collapse of communism, that's a nice term that we continue to use here, meant the ultimate triumph of free market capitalism. And, as such, it was at effectively the discretion of the West to look at these now politically discarded governments in Eastern Europe and say, your only way forward, your only path towards democracy is to do exactly what the West did, but on a faster and more thorough level. So that is, get rid of all kinds of socialist elements, get rid of the social welfare state, open your businesses and companies and industries up to foreign investment, which more often than not is going to result in your, small little rinky-dink companies being bought out by larger, more established things. But, as far as, let's say, the automobile industry is concerned. Hey guys, wouldn't you rather drive a Volkswagen or a Mercedes instead of a crappy Dacia or a Yugo? And was this a right assessment of 1989? And is this also one of the reasons why a lot of us still get surprised at the rise of illiberal populist parties and movements in areas, in countries that we long assumed to be consolidated liberal democracies? Now, if we just assumed that Solidarity was anti-communist, anti-Marxist, pro-capitalist, pro-Western, and Poland was the poster child for the country that did all the right things, had your civil society, negotiated with the elements of the old regime, democratized, got into the EU, it was just sort of like the first among equals, well, then what explains this sudden and apparent lapse into social conservative parochialism that some people are like, I never saw this coming in Poland? What explains the rise of illiberal power brokerage political control that characterizes Orban's Hungary, right? It's one thing to kind of look at, sort of creeping authoritarianism in the Balkans and, play that up to existing stereotypes that, well, the Balkans are the Balkans, ancient hatreds, blah, blah, blah. But Central Europe was regarded as, well, just Europe for that sense. So are the reasons why things happening the way that they are in Central Europe are because of what we misread in 1989? Or are there things that were not covered? Are there things that were somehow discarded, discredited, and they're now coming back to haunt a new generation of voters and political actors? So in a way, the idea of post-communism still has a lot of saliency. Because let's take a look at the, so-called quote-unquote post-communist world in 2021. And the first sobering reality is that we note a number of liberal democracies are in decline. We see, beyond, let's say, Orban and Vučić, the rise of electoral strongmen and political power brokers in Central Europe, in the former Soviet Union. Central Asia has basically been nothing but political power brokers since the 1990s. And, even in, as I've already mentioned, countries that we long regarded as success stories, they might be consolidated democracies in structure, but they still have a long ways to go in terms of becoming consolidated democracies in practice. And we don't see this really until the Syrian civil war and the influx of refugees coming from the Middle East, from war-torn countries like Syria and Iraq, but also Northern Africa like Libya. And, this major migration of people seeking asylum, safe haven from failing states within the European Union, they're all kind of going to, Germany, France, Denmark, what have you. But the European Union kind of made a fateful decision and said to all of its members that all of them are going to have to take some amount of asylum seekers, right? They can't all go to one place. And it was right then and there that we found out from Poland, Hungary, the Czech Republic, among others, that they don't want any of them, right? For the very simple reason, they don't want Arabs. They don't want Muslims within their countries. Their countries, they argue, are small. They are the only countries that provide home states for their particular national kin, and they don't want to see the type of cosmopolitan chaos that permeates the streets of Paris and Berlin or London, in Budapest or Warsaw or others, right? So when we say that liberal democracies are in decline, we kind of note that many erstwhile liberal democracies still retained high degrees of ethnocentrism, xenophobia, and even downright racism within their political cultures. And these are things that we didn't notice in the early years of transition and consolidation because these countries didn't have any minorities, beyond, let's say, Roma, which are just systemically discriminated against throughout Europe. Now, this stuff doesn't really make the headlines. So, the unfortunate reality is that liberal democracy has been challenged for the last number of years. And, here we are in 2021. Many of them are, if they haven't receded into some kind of illiberal populist movement, there are certainly parties and movements within these countries that are gaining electoral saliency. The second thing that we have to note is the relative decline in leverage that is the European Union. Right? The EU's light at the end of the tunnel is no longer as accepted and as unassailable as it once was. Certainly, for many countries that have gotten into the EU, the organization has done much to help move the country towards some type of consolidated democracy, but more so in a structural sense than anything else. It's been effectively more than 12 years since the beginning of the 2008 economic recession. But the European Union kind of revealed itself to be what it really was. And this isn't any kind of criticism on an organization as so much it is an acceptance of what it was designed to be, an economic regulatory body, not a liberal democratic organization. And as many countries noticed with, let's say, Greece or Portugal, or even Spain and Italy for that matter, the European Union will place the primacy of economic solvency and stability over any kind of social democracy. And if austerity measures are necessary in order to balance one's budget and keep the banks from failing, then that's exactly what the EU is going to do. Now, this is not lost on many countries, both trying to still get in and already in the EU, that, surprise, surprise, the people that run the country place economic stability over any kind of democratic accountability. And because of the '08 crisis and the idea that, the countries that are still trying to get in are not exactly economic contributors to the larger framework, there's a general resistance, hesitancy, almost fatigue in expanding membership to the remaining 5 or so countries in the Balkans that have not yet got in: Serbia, Montenegro, Macedonia, Bosnia, and Albania. Among all 5 of those, Serbia might be the most likely, the most contributory, but that's largely relegated to the capital of Belgrade and, a few prosperous agricultural towns and cities in the northern province of Vojvodina. The point that I'm trying to make here is that the EU's big glossy image of it being the light at the end of the tunnel, the panacea for all of one's problems, economic, political, social, cultural, it's kind of past its point. The EU has effectively gutted countries like Greece in the name of economic stability. And for a country like Serbia that wants to get in, it's looking at what happened to Greece and other countries saying, is this what I really want? And for countries that just recently got in, the idea of the EU making everything better, Greece serves as a reminder that, things aren't as stable or as prosperous as things might be. And, for countries that have not yet gotten in, like Serbia, this is also taking place amid the backdrop of a resurgent Russia and an emergent China. Not in terms of diplomatic alternatives, but economic alternatives. Right? Serbia has been playing all three cards quite well. The EU card, the Russian card, and the Chinese card, which doesn't really care what your ideology is, as long as you're willing to invest in their large-scale industrial projects. So the point I'm trying to make here is that the EU is no longer the only thing that serves as, an endpoint for democratic evolution. And while I'm not here to tell you that the EU is on the verge of collapse, it certainly has lost its monopoly on its image, right? Its branding image as something positive, contributory, and evolutionary. A third thing that we need to note about 2021, and this has been going on for about more than a decade or so, are the consequences of what we in the academic field call colored revolutions, which oftentimes produce rotten transitions. 1989 was not the only moment that defined social revolution, social protests against entrenched, corrupt, dysfunctional, and inept governments. But whereas 89 to 91 kind of caught a lot of these bureaucratic authoritarian regimes off guard and forced them to basically negotiate themselves into irrelevancy, after that, many successive governments, which kept on the same traditions of dysfunctionality, inept competency, corruption, and others, were voted into power. Now, it is much more difficult to dislodge a government that was voted into power than one that just kind of you were born into. And in this case, when colored revolutions take place in places like Georgia, Ukraine, Armenia, Kyrgyzstan, what may end up happening is that the leadership of the entrenched government is replaced, overthrown, but the system of government isn't. The network of clientelism, corruption, and nepotism just continues unabated, but with new people, new powers, new political parties that come to that come into play. What's more so is that if colored revolutions produce the type of CNN effect, in which there are thousands of people in the public square in the capitals that are calling for the end of the regime, the end of crony leadership, especially if that entrenched leadership happens to be pro-Kremlin, anti-American, anti-Western. Western press is going to just by default, almost knee-jerk, take a sympathetic tone to the protests. Now, many of the ordinary people are rightly justified in voicing their grievances. But there's no political alternative, right? There's no formulated civil society that is ready to not only replace the entrenched government, but form a new constitution, a new set of rule of laws, and really gut the bureaucratic system that just continues with this type of patronage and clientelism, regardless of who is at the top. Now, if the United States, of course, takes sympathy within these movements, and oftentimes backs political opponents like Alexei Navalny in Russia, or outside the region, the big thing is Juan Guaido in Venezuela is the guy that will make everything better. I mean, they're kind of seen as American stooges. They're on the payroll of the State Department, the CIA, especially if they get positive tweets from Hillary Clinton or Joe Biden or Barack Obama, or when he was alive, John McCain. Whatever legitimate protests that the public might have against the entrenched regime, this stuff is going to be used against them as a way of showing that the opposition to government is ultimately controlled and manipulated by, the United States or the Soros Foundation or the CIA or, whatever kind of, conspiracy theories that you have, leading to little to no change, whatsoever. And finally, we have to acknowledge that for every consolidated democracy in the so-called post-communist world, there is an entrenched autocratic regime. Russia, Belarus, Azerbaijan, Turkmenistan, I mean, these are not the only examples of them, but we're looking at countries that may have had some kind of opportunity for reform and modernization in the early 90s, but quickly fell under increasing autocratic governance since then. And, Russia and Belarus are the two that are mostly within the, the news because of the politics of Putin and Lukashenko. respectfully. But Azerbaijan is little more than an autocratic client state of Turkey. Recently waged a successful but rather brutal war against Armenia and effectively took back most of the territory that it had lost in the early 90s surrounding the Nagorno-Karabakh region. We'll talk about that in due time. And, I mentioned a few slides ago that, Turkmenistan was characterized by the rather bombastic and oftentimes ridiculous leadership of Sapar Murat Niyazov, Turkmenbashi. But when he died, he was succeeded by another political strongman with his own brand of autocratic, Borat-like ridiculousness. And this is not unique to Central Asia. Most of the Stan countries have become more autocratic, more authoritarian than they were within their Soviet periods. So, the post-communist world of 2021 is kind of a mixed bag here. I decided to use the data from Freedom House as a way of trying to get my point across. And, I have my issues with the ratings that are given by Freedom House. I don't know if any of you are familiar with this think tank, but it's an organization that every year measures the degree of freedom around the world in every country and territory. And, the degrees of freedom are measured on the degrees of political rights and civil liberties in each country, both of which are given numerical scores ranging from 1 to 7, 1 being the most free and 7 being not free at all. Measuring both political rights and civil liberties creates an aggregate degree that, gives one a sense of, how free each of the countries are. There's, many, many interpretations and nuances that go into this quantitative study. But for the sake of giving you a general sense of where we are, here is Europe, mostly in green. Here's Poland, Czech Republic, Slovakia, Croatia, Slovenia, Romania, Bulgaria, Greece. They are free to a certain degree, right? But Hungary and Serbia, these are the two big ones. Hungary and Serbia were previously regarded as free, but in the last year or so were downgraded to partly free. And this has a lot to do with the executive authority of Orban in Hungary, Vučić in Serbia, but also the lack of any real political opposition and alternatives. And the partly free status has been basically endemic to Bosnia, Montenegro, Albania, Macedonia. Freedom House does regard Kosovo as a separate entity from that of Serbia. But when we look at the former Soviet Union, it's much more bleaker in the sense that there is just a vast amount of not freeism, if you really want to call it this. The high points are Ukraine and Moldova and Georgia and Armenia, but Azerbaijan, Russia, the Stan countries, at the absolute best, Russia entered the partly free in the early 90s, but quickly receded back into autocracy under Putin. And just as a separate thing, here's Mongolia, just kind of chilling out in the middle of authoritarianism, all democratic and all, with its yaks and yurts or whatever it is, right? So it's just one of those things that Mongolia is just kind of like, we're democratic, just because it's basically the capital, it's a bunch of tents, it's Genghis Khan, and it's a lot of really good emerging heavy metal bands. And of course, there's also South Korea and Japan. To put this into I think a better perspective here, I have given you really the recent rankings that Freedom House has given to all of our countries under study, political rights and civil liberties. And I've color-coded them, right? So Central Europe is in blue, Southeastern Europe in green, Russia and the near abroad in red, and Central Asia in brown. The different degrees in color, just in case you were wondering, I've added the Baltic states to Central Europe. Geographically speaking, they're not really Central Europe, but they are usually lumped into, the communities of the Czech Republic, Slovakia, Slovenia, Poland, and Hungary, just because of the nature of their democratic transition and the way that the European Union just sort of saw them in the same light. The same thing with color coding here in Russia and the near abroad. The core countries there are Russia, Belarus, and Ukraine. We'll also include Moldova, Georgia, and Armenia. But if you notice here, the rating of free is effectively from 1 to, I think it's 2.5. Not a surprise. Almost all of the countries of Central Europe are free. And every single one of them here, up to Poland, and up to Romania, also including Hungary, are in the European Union. Things get a bit more gray, a little blurry when we look at countries of Southeastern Europe. Croatia, a Southeastern European country, is in the European Union. It is given a rating of 1.5. I think that might be a little too generous. But, in comparison to its Bosnian and Macedonian and Montenegrin counterparts, it's certainly doing much, much better. But not a surprise that once we get to partly free countries, with the exception of Hungary, every single one of them, especially in green, are still EU aspiring countries. They're not in the European Union. Hungary is the only major exception, and that is largely because of the near monopoly on power exhibited by Orban's Fidesz movement. And once we look at the countries of the former Soviet Union, not the Baltic states like Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, but everyone else, the best ones end up being partly free, but more than half or so are within the not free. So this kind of tells you that as far as at least quantitatively speaking, right, regionalism is important. Central Europe remains at the forefront of democratic development. Southeastern Europe, the Balkans, are kind of in that halfway house. They're not as good as their Central European counterparts, but they are doing, comparatively speaking, better than most of the countries of the former Soviet Union. And when we look at the former USSR, outside of those three Baltic states, it just gets more and more depressing as we get down to, just absolute autocratic states in Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, and Turkmenistan. So, by way of a conclusion to this, beginning lecture, this beginning foray into the series, we can come away with a few preliminary hypotheses based on just some simple observations from 2021. The first hypothesis, and one that I really want to emphasize in the coming talks, is that states are more likely to transition towards consolidated democracies if they are geographically close to and have a clear path of membership in transatlantic organizations like NATO and the European Union. Conversely, the further away these countries happen to be, the less likely for membership and the closer in influence to Russia and or China, which also means that the less democracy is likely. And look, let's just go back to the map. The closer you are to the European Union, the greater you are to be green, or at the least case, yellow. This even includes Ukraine, which is the one, Ukraine and Moldova, right? Because they border the European Union. Further away you are, the more likely a country is to remain some kind of autocratic. In fact, even worse than they were under the Soviet Union. Now, this kind of confirms many of the hypotheses of European Union structuralists. If the European Union looks at your country as an eventual member, said country is much more likely to make a number of reforms and, yes, difficult decisions in order to restructure the country towards some kind of liberal democracy and market economy. However, and this also confirms the data from Freedom House, the allure and pull of the European Union has waned since roughly 2008 to 2012, right? The 08 economic recession that lasted for a couple of years, as I already mentioned, discredited the idea that the European Union is the light at the end of the tunnel. If the countries were already in the EU, they had to make a number of necessary structural changes in the name of economic solvency. But it was much easier for them to do so than, let's say, those that were, on the outskirts. So those that did not get into the EU during this period, and the only one that did was Croatia, Not a surprise, again, let's go back to the map here. Not a surprise that the countries, and yes, if I include Kosovo territory, that has not entered the EU yet, is within this partly free scenario. Now, again, we're just drawing interpretations from data, but there is some saliency to this hypothesis. And finally, and this is going to be the subject of the next lecture, communism, Marxism, state socialism, whatever we understand them to be today, I think it's safe enough to hypothesize that all three have had very little to no effect on the nature, capabilities, and degrees of freedom in states today. That's not to say that the communist legacy is irrelevant, but 1989 was not about opposing communism. 1989 was not a referendum on Marxism. 1989, 1990 was, if nothing else, a public reckoning of a series of increasingly unstable, inept, corrupt, and resistant bureaucratic authoritarian regimes that either A, negotiated themselves out of power and into retirement and subsequent immunity, or tried to fight to remain in power, lost everything in the ensuing, aftermath. But any notion of Marxism, socialism, communism, beyond symbolic, presence, had little to, if anything, to do with the reasons for public anger and resentment in 89 to 91. Most of the former Soviet republics today, whether it is, authoritarianism or partly free hybrid regimes, again, less to do with the Soviet Union and more to do with events of the 1990s. The same thing with many of the former Yugoslav republics and territories. The problems regarding Bosnia and Montenegro today have more to do with power arrangements in the 90s. The stagnation of democracy in Serbia today actually has more to do with the frozen conflict regarding Kosovo than anything coming out of the Yugoslav period. And, by that measure, I also am going to throw down the gauntlet and hypothesize that the rise of illiberal national populism stems more from the 2008 economic crisis and the non-democratic, technocratic approaches by the European Union and the West, particularly, as I already said, towards Greece, than any communist legacy of the 1990s. Now, that's not to say that we will throw out the legacy of communism altogether, but much of the problems that we see facing these countries, regions, and territories today in 2021 has less to do with what happened in the 80s and the 70s and the 60s, and more to do what happened in the 2010s, the 2000s, and the 1990s. So that means that there's going to have to be a lot of comparative historical analysis, process tracing, and really a sense of backstory studies to help us understand why states are where they are, why they do what they do, and why they value what they value. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is our big introduction into the region. There is a lot of material that I am so looking forward to providing all of you. And we will begin by critically assessing the events surrounding 1989, the nature of authoritarian collapse, the nature of authoritarianism in each of these countries. So metaphorically speaking, please join me in East Berlin for our next lecture as we begin to look at the events that characterize 1989 to 1990 and what we need to understand in terms of moving forward. So welcome once again to this class. Welcome to Eastern Europe. Welcome to the chaos, the dysfunctionality, and the absolute joy that it is to study this region. So I will see you very quickly in our next lecture on the legacies of 1989, and then we will move into our first region, Central Europe. So stay tuned.